Hello and welcome to another episode of the djproject Criterion Collection. And here we're going to talk about Spine 359, The Double Life of Veronique, directed by Krzysztof Kieślowski, 1991. I remember this film was recommended to me by a professor I had at William & Mary as an example of music in film, and particularly in the last several films of Kieślowski, namely the Decalogue, this, and also the Trois Couleurs, or the Three Colors trilogy. There's a close relationship between Kieślowski and his composer Zbigniew Priestner, and excuse me. In fact, it was one of those not common situations, but also not entirely rare, where the composer is brought in to the production as the production develops and as the script is developed. So in other words, he's there from the very beginning, whereas most of the time the composers show up at the end of the film. And it's this integration of music and film that very much is part of the fabric, and they both inform each other. Later Kieślowski it's those films that I cited, and if I hadn't said this already, I'm going to say this again. The Decalogue needs to be released through Criterion. Whatever I need, if there's any way I can help to make that happen, please. They're a wonderful set of films. It needs to be, it needs to be treated with care and with love, and I think it's rightfully deserved to be a part of it. So please put the Decalogue on there. It was great. It's great that the Double Life of Véronique and the Trois Couleurs are on there. So now let's just complete it. But I majorly digress. The thing about later Kieślowski is that it's another example of poetic cinema. I mentioned this before with The Spirit of the Beehive, where it's images and in this case it's images, music, little dialogue, but mostly action that can provide some commentary on more abstract things. And this is something that Kieślowski was very interested in later in his career. Brief overview of his career. He represents a later generation of Polish film directors, whereas Wajda is sort of the beginnings of a more international Polish cinema. He's a second or third generation, actually second generation of a group of Polish film directors that had a career in a very interesting and actually quite turbulent time for Poland. It was you had in the 70s more and more films that are addressing some of the concerns of Poland, particularly with the continuing sort of Soviet occupation of the country, and I want to say that it was I want to say it was called the cinema of anxiety. This is what kind of came about, and Kieślowski was part of that, and then by the turn of the 80s, martial law was declared in Poland, and also I forget if it came before or after, but also during that time the Solidarity movement emerged, and Poland was going through I think pretty much unbeknownst to them, but it ended up being in a very turbulent and exciting transition where eventually by 1988, I believe, or 89 or so, they had cast off the communist yoke, and they finally felt free for the first time in decades. Remember, this is the country that got run over. They got run over by the Russians. They got run over by the Germans. They got run over by the Russians again. And now this. But beginning in the 80s, this was Kieślowski. Well, first off, Kieślowski started off doing documentaries also, and then he reached a point in his documentary making career where he felt that documentaries were too invasive, and that he really needed to sort of back away from that. And interestingly enough, it was a situation where Wells had once advised not to show on film, and that is a couple making love. So, anyways, beginning in the 80s, he started to be a little bit more, for lack of a better word, he started to become more mystical, although it's one of those words that you can't help but use, but at the same time it also implies something that he's not. Again, that whole spiritual filmmaker thing. But he was definitely interested, but actually maybe a better way of saying it is he was more interested in deeper and more abstract things. And plus it was also a way of kind of circumventing censorship. As I mentioned before with The Spirit of the Beehive, that's something that I find quite fascinating about films that are made during within oppressive regimes and equally oppressive censors, is how do you communicate your message and evade the censors. And actually, this is something that Kieślowski has mentioned is kind of a nice side effect of something like that. I mean, of course, oppression is not something to be desired, much less condoned, but there is a certain advantage of working under those conditions. It stimulates a certain creativity. But The Double Life of Veronique was the beginnings of his late career, where he had garnered enough of an international reputation, particularly through the Decalogue, and also the feature films that stemmed from Decalogue, a short film about killing and a short film about love. And because of this reputation, he was able to work outside of Poland and go to France. And the first film that he was able to make under this new arrangement was The Double Life of Veronique. Now, the film itself, it looks at two parallel lives that are bound together in some unexplained, unclear way, but there is a connection between the two, and they both share the same name. One, Veronica from Poland. Particularly, she lives in Krakow, I believe, or she goes to Krakow for a concert. But anyways, she's in Poland. While she was trained in piano, she also demonstrates herself to be a soprano, and she has won the chance to sing the lead in a new composition that was going to premiere, and I believe this is in Krakow. She's also known to have a very weak heart, and this kind of does her in the middle of the premiere as she's singing. And actually, the lines she sings, they come from Dante's Paradiso from La Commedia. And after she sings the first couple lines, she drops dead because of the heart condition. Now, in the meantime, this is sort of mystically felt, not quite. I felt a great disturbance in the force, but something of the mystical realm. To the other Veronica, Veronique, in France, who is on the she's on the verge of a. It seems that she's almost in it. She's in a similar situation to Veronique, where she's gonna hit big, and she's gonna be very. She's on the verge of being very prominent as a singer, but then she backs off from this. She has the suspicion that it's probably not going to be the best route for her, or that she wants to do something else, so she steps back from it. She's also known to have some heart troubles, and she decides to concentrate on being a music teacher. And in one day at school, she sees a marionette show, and she's very enamored by it, and eventually she's drawn into a love stratagem that was devised by him. And which is kind of interesting because the technical name for a puppeteer who works with marionettes is the manipulator. So, is Veronique manipulated by love? Whereas we tend to think whereas most of us operate under the assumption that love at its best comes from choice. But does love, in a sense, manipulate us? See, these are the kinds of things that you can extrapolate from this. The other thing you can extrapolate from is you kind of wonder if this planted a seed in Jean-Pierre Genet's mind, and then it turned full blossom into a component in Le Fabuleux Destin d'Amélie Poulain. Food for thought. There's a lot that I could talk about in relation to the film. You know, the notion of parallel lives and the unexplained nature of love, and also music. But one thing that really strikes me is these parallel lives, that you have one in Poland and the other in France, and one has to wonder if this was a kind of amusing on Kieślowski's part of a situation where he's in, where he felt like he was almost living two lives, or he was, or that he could live two different lives. There was one life in Poland, the other life in France. One, you could only go so far, and he experienced a kind of metaphorical death, and then France allowed him to have a kind of second life, and he was able to go in that way. Now, of course, interestingly enough, he would die 5 years later, and again from heart troubles, and one could also suspect that maybe he was foreshadowing his own death. I don't know if that's reading too much into it, maybe that's taking a little bit too far, but I really think that the film, in spite of how perhaps maybe overdone the interpretations are, or how overzealous the interpretations are, I do think that you can't fault the film for inviting these kinds of ponderings. It's set up to be to provide musings on certain things, and it does it in a very cinematic fashion. In fact, in a way that I think even Bresson would find very appropriate. Yes, I'm going to talk about him very soon, so that's why he's kind of on my mind. But this could be an example of cinematographique. There you go. You know, Bresson has a very particular word for it, but this may be an example of cinematographique or cinematography as Bresson defines it, and I'll get into that once I talk about Mouchette. But done outside of Bresson. But at any rate, I would say that this film is a very good single introduction to Kieślowski. Another recommendation I would I would make, certainly on the Criterion side of things, would be to see Trois Couleurs. Because there you get 3 films and they all work in a certain unity. But if you don't have time for 3 films, or if you're not really sure if you want to tackle on that kind of project, a safe bet would be to go through the Double Life of Véronique. And again, I really love the Decalogue, and I really want that to be on Criterion at some point. I've been holding off on it. You know, it's a great set of films. I really love it, and it really needs to be on there. So there needs to be more Kieślowski. Another interesting thing about Kieślowski is one of his films that he made in the 80s. Oh, never mind. I'm not gonna. Okay, I completely forgot the title, but of it, and shame on me. I should have done much better preparations for this, but it interestingly provided a. I think I'll try to remember this when I talk about Trois Couleurs, but anyways, this film, the storyline and the setup and so forth would later be sort of remade into Run Lola Run. So, but at any rate, and then also another little bit of trivia. And yes, this could be viewed as shameless advertisement, but then again, other people on YouTube do this, so why should I be any different? This film and The Spirit of the Beehive appear as plot points in one of the films I wrote and would like to produce and direct on Nights Like This. The situation is that Christopher meets this woman, Elena, and it's over in the DVD section, and he ends up browsing through the Criterion section, and he notices that the Double Life of Veronique is available. He grabs that. He's going to purchase it for himself, and then he also purchases while he's there because he wanted to get this title, The Spirit of the Beehive. He ends up purchasing both, and that forms the basis of their first date, as they see both of those films. They see Spirit of the Beehive first, they talk about it a little bit, and then they see the Double Life of Veronique. And interestingly, she sleeps through it, but he still watches it. And I take that as, had she seen it, she probably would have gotten some signs into some aspects of his personality that probably would have served her interest further down the road. Now, the reason why I put those 2 titles is because in one of the earlier drafts or attempts at writing this, both of those films had just come out on Criterion, and these were titles that I was interested in getting myself. And I think I already gotten them at that point as well. And so it became one of those things where my interests kind of translated into him. Of course, I also knew that he was going to be a music and film critic, so he was going to be interested in this anyway, so why not? And it's something that's still carried over, and I still think that it's quite appropriate for those 2 films to be part of our first date. Of course, any of them could have worked, but there's just something about it. And plus, I feel that Kieślowski does kind of inform a bit, and that film in particular, just the notion of parallel lives, and because there's also that aspect into it as well. But in a very mild way, not in a very overt way. So it's not like the whole thing is a big homage. So, but yes, like I said, definitely check out the Double Life of Veronique. It's a more poetic cinema. It may try your patience on certain things, but if you stick with it, if you just concentrate on particularly the images and the music and the way action is played out and the way everything just flows. If you pay attention to that, then that's where it gets rewarded. If you try to, it's not to say that there isn't a narrative, it is there, but it's not, it's not forefront. It's not the major concern. The major concern is these two women and how they live and how they are similar to each other but at the same time distinct from each other, and it raises some things that are interesting to ponder. So, and legitimately ponder. It's not something that's tacked on after the fact, or it's not something to give it more weight than it deserves. In other words, it's not done for the sake of pretentious or being pretentious. It's rightfully deserved. So, there you go. The Double Life of Veronique. And until next time, take care.